In 2008, the world was collapsing. Banks were failing. Millions of people were losing their homes. The global economy was in chaos. Trust in the financial system was disappearing. Investors were pulling back. Startups were dying. Fear was everywhere. It was probably the worst possible time to start a company. But in the middle of this disaster, three broke guys with credit card debt decided to build one anyway. This is the story of how Airbnb survived the 2008 financial crisis and turned chaos into opportunity. To understand this story, we need to go back to the beginning. In 2007, two roommates in San Francisco were struggling to pay rent. Their names were Brian Chesky and Joe Gebbia. They were designers. They had big dreams. But they didn't have money. One weekend, a major design conference came to the city. Hotels were fully booked, so they had a simple idea. What if they rented out air mattresses in their living room? They created a basic website. They called it Air Bed and Breakfast. 3 people showed up. That was it. 3 guests. But something important happened. Strangers were willing to stay in someone else's home. It sounds normal today. In 2008, it sounded crazy. Then the financial crisis hit harder. The housing bubble exploded in the United States. Major financial institutions collapsed. Unemployment surged, and investors stopped writing checks. Airbnb started pitching to dozens of investors. Most of them said no. Some said the idea was ridiculous. People will never trust strangers. This isn't scalable. Just get a real job. They kept hearing rejection, again and again and again. At one point, they only had enough money to survive for a few weeks. Imagine trying to build a startup while the entire economy is falling apart. When banks are collapsing, when headlines are full of panic, when everyone thinks you're crazy. Most founders would have quit. They didn't. Instead, they got creative. During the 2008 U.S. presidential election, they designed limited edition cereal boxes, political-themed cereal. They sold them as collectibles. It sounds ridiculous, but it worked. They raised around $30,000. That money kept the company alive. Cereal saved Airbnb. Think about that. A future billion-dollar company survived because of cereal boxes. But something else was happening at the same time. The crisis was destroying traditional systems. Banks failed. Mortgage lenders failed. Confidence in institutions collapsed. And when old systems fail, new systems start to appear. People were desperate for extra income. Homeowners needed cash. Suddenly, renting out a spare room didn't sound strange. It sounded smart. At the same time, travelers were looking for cheaper alternatives to hotels. They wanted flexibility. They wanted affordability. They wanted something different. The crisis created both supply and demand. Supply from people who needed money. Demand from people who needed cheaper travel. Airbnb was perfectly positioned. Not because the economy was strong, but because it was weak. In 2009, they joined Y Combinator. They refined the platform. They improved the website. They focused obsessively on trust, better photos, user reviews, identity verification. They even flew to New York to personally photograph hosts' apartments. They understood something critical. Trust was the product. By 2010, thousands of guests had used the platform. By 2012, it was millions. Revenue was growing rapidly. And something interesting happened. Cities that were hit hardest by the recession showed some of the strongest Airbnb adoption because people needed income. The worse the economy felt, the more attractive Airbnb became. This wasn't just a startup. It was part of a bigger shift from ownership to access, from hotels to homes, from centralized institutions to peer-to-peer platforms. By 2011, Airbnb was expanding internationally. By 2014, it was valued at around $10 billion, from 3 air mattresses to a global hospitality giant, all born in the middle of one of the worst financial crises in modern history. So, what can we learn from this? First, crisis creates opportunity. When fear rises, new needs appear. Second, rejection is normal. Most investors didn't believe in Airbnb. If they had listened to the crowd, the company would not exist. Third, survival requires creativity. Sometimes that means selling cereal. Sometimes that means knocking on doors and taking photos yourself. And finally, the best businesses don't wait for perfect conditions. They adapt to imperfect ones. Airbnb didn't survive because the economy was strong. It survived because it understood the problem the crisis created and solved it. While banks were collapsing, a new kind of company was being built. And the next crisis? It might already be creating the next billion-dollar idea.